Okay, let's talk literature review. This is kind of one of my favorite parts of doing research, is actually reviewing the literature, because I learn a lot in this process, because you're evaluating the state of the art. You're presenting the state of the art in what we know in terms of our knowledge on a specific subject. But I want to caution you, because literature reviews, they're kind of the mindset that I think a lot of people come at them with is that it's just a summary. It's just a summary of the research, of what research is out there. And so I've seen a lot of literature reviews that are just article summaries. And this to me is not a literature review, because there's no synthesis there. And then I've seen literature reviews that kind of group some articles together and they just provide a summary of those articles. And sure, that might be part of your literature review, but it's definitely not the end game here. What you're really trying to do with the literature review is contextualize what a variety of different scientific topics in relation to your research aims. So again, we're trying to contextualize a series of different scientific topics, all of which might be interrelated in some way, in some key dimensions that are also related to your topic. And what you want to do is give the reader an understanding for how those ideas relate to what you're investigating, what you're researching. So contextualization is the number one thing behind a literature review, giving a reader an understanding for how your research relates to the state of the art when it comes to our knowledge on a variety of topics. Now, when you're doing a literature review, the most important thing here is that it's anchored in science. So you need to seek out scientific articles. What that means is looking for peer-reviewed journals, peer-reviewed academic scientific journals. Now, how do you know if a journal is peer-reviewed? Well, one place is just to start with a good database. Google Scholar is really good when it comes to unearthing relevant scientific articles. And usually you can just read the title of the journal and you get a general understanding if that journal is a scientific and an academic journal. And then if you really want to kind of dig deep, open up that journal's website and look to see what's the peer review process. Is there a peer review process? And try to understand what's the impact of that journal, or maybe even just what's the scientific relevance of that journal for your area of research, but also for the world of science in general. So start with scientific articles. Now, it's okay to sort of pepper into your literature review scientific reports that maybe were produced by government or industry or any other actor, any other organization. But I would keep these to a limit. I would try to make sure that those don't take up the bulk of the references in your literature review, because those articles, they're not necessarily peer-reviewed, and so they don't always carry the same scientific weight that a peer-reviewed academic article would have. And that brings up another issue: book chapters in kind of edited volumes, or books in general. Now, that really comes down to who the author is. So you might want to seek out the name of the author and try to understand what is their background. Are they just an industry person who is trying to create an academic article who, hopefully could get this out there so that their company could build off of that? Or is it a government, somebody who works for the government who's just trying to push an agenda? Or is it another scientist? Is it someone who has an academic career? And so that will give it a little bit more legitimacy, but the edited volumes and the books are not necessarily held to the same caliber as a scientific journal article, because they're not always peer-reviewed. The scientific journals typically are peer-reviewed. The edited volumes and book chapters and books are not necessarily peer-reviewed. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't use and reference those books and those book chapters. It's only to say that you can kind of take them with a grain of salt, and that your primary concentration should be on these scientific journals. So focus on scientific journals, books and edited volumes a little bit, and less so academic reports published by government or industry. And then there's another category of kind of references that we can include in our literature review, and that is laws and policies. So laws and policies are just things that government puts out that says, hey, this is what we're doing. Law, I think everyone knows, but a policy is just a kind of a document, a normative document. Hey, this is an important thing, important issue. Now, those may be relevant for your literature review, so you should include it, but again, those shouldn't be the basis for your literature review. Your basis should always be scientific knowledge. What do we know in the field of science around these areas? One of the trappings I find a lot of students, a lot of people that I work with and students fall into is this issue of importance and relevance. And so what they want to do in the literature review is tell me how important. They want to tell the reader how important what they found is, or how important what this article is. And so they'll use that word, this is an important finding because blah, 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 blah. I always caution my students from doing that. I always caution the people I work with from doing that, because if you're having to tell a reader that something is important, then you haven't made a good enough case for why it's important. So you really should take a step back. If you find yourself using that word, this is really important, take a step back and think about how you can present that piece of work where the reader can then interpret the level of importance. Then they can understand a little bit better. This has a high degree of relevance. It's really important for what their line of thinking is. So try to avoid using telling the reader how to feel about a specific finding or a specific piece of knowledge. Another really key issue here is how you structure your literature review. Now, I've said before in the organization video that you should have 2 to 3 headings and then 2 to 3 paragraphs underneath that. That's fine. In literature review, you might want to extend it a little bit, so maybe you go 3 to 4 headings, 3 to 4 paragraphs, and that's fine. These are just rules of thumb. But what I want to get to here is how you arrange each topic. Now, you can think of your headings more or less like keywords. What are the keywords that are associated with your topic that you're investigating, your research aim? And if you can think along those lines, then you can start to see a more or less kind of a map, a mind map, or a bubble diagram of different ideas that are related to your topic. And again, we want to kind of narrow them as much as possible, keep it around 3 or 4 so that you're not giving your reader more information than they actually need in order to understand your work. And that's what it comes down to in a literature review, is really you're just trying to give the reader enough understanding about the world of science that's related to your topic so that they can interpret and understand what your findings are. And the relevance and importance of your findings and how that extends research in some significant way. So whenever you're structuring your headings, I always like to think big to small. So what's the big ideas, the big topic areas that are associated with your research, and then take me one step at a time to narrow until the narrowest heading should be really closely related to your research aim, almost identical if there's any kind of research out there about that topic, or really close, just one step removed. And then everything before that gets a little bit more abstract, maybe a little bit more theoretical. I also find often that the first heading is probably going to contain the most references and citations, and then as you go through the literature review, every subsequent section will have kind of a fewer number of citations and references. So that means that you're going to have to think ahead about all the research literature that you've read or that you've reviewed, and try to organize it in some way that shows some meaning to the reader of how they're kind of going about, how you're taking them on that journey in your paper. So that means you might have to reorganize things frequently, and that means reorganizing headings. Okay, maybe put this heading above that one or that one below that one, and reorganize paragraphs within a heading and paragraphs between headings. So you might look at a series of paragraphs within a heading and say, actually, we should move this paragraph to the beginning and that paragraph towards the end, and then it makes a little bit more sense, or there's a clearer line, clearer thread, so that the reader has a clear path to follow. And you might say, oh, well, on this heading, I have these 3 or 4 paragraphs, but this paragraph doesn't really belong to this heading. I need to move it to a different heading. And that's okay. That's what you should be doing. That shows that you have some reflection and some of your analytic mindset when you're going about your literature review. And then the last thing is at the end of each heading, at the end of each section of your literature review, that heading or that paragraph I would dedicate to explaining to the reader how what they've just read in that heading, under that heading, relates to your research topic. So you start a heading with kind of an introductory paragraph that lays the basic framework for that heading. This is what we're going to be talking about in this heading. Then you give me 2, maybe 3 paragraphs that get into that issue in depth. And then on the last paragraph, take me back to your aim. So what does all of this knowledge mean when it comes to the aim of your research? What it is that you're trying to discover, what it is that you're trying to reveal or investigate. That will really help the reader, and again, kind of walk them through the section. When they start a section, they're like, okay, this is what the section's about. Here's some interesting information. Maybe here's some more interesting information. And then finally, how all of that information relates to your topic, your key area of investigation. Now the reader has a good understanding, a good anchoring in what you're doing, and then they can go into the next section. So, the recap. 1, contextualization. That's what literature reviews are all about. Contextualizing your research aims in relation to the huge wealth of knowledge that is out there. Number 2, use scientific articles. Use something like Google Scholar to find them, but make sure that most of your literature review is anchored in those scientific articles. And I usually recommend my students, if it's a kind of 10-page paper, to shoot for 20 references in the literature review. Try to find 20 really good references, solid references that relate to the topics that you're exploring in the literature review. Now, you're always going to find more knowledge than you can fit in a literature review, so that's an important part of this process, is really synthesizing and digesting, distilling all the amount of knowledge out there, or at least all of the relevant knowledge that's relevant to your research topic, into a short synthesis. Number 3, always go big to small. Give me the grandest ideas, the broadest ideas, the ideas that are broadest in scope, the ideas that have the most research behind them, and the ideas that are more theoretical and abstract, and then walk me through step by step things that are a little bit more concrete, a little bit less abstract, and a little bit more focused on your research topic.